Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Jeff Smith. Many of you know me as Dr. Jeff. I've been the writer of the In Search of New Violets column in the African Violet magazine for quite a number of years now, and I'm delighted to be asked to do a presentation at the 75th Diamond Celebration of the African Violet Society, and today we're going to be talking about the science of flowering. The objectives for this presentation are basically twofold. I want to talk a little bit about the background of African violets and what we know about their flowers. And secondly, to answer the question, how do I get my African violets to bloom or to bloom more productively? We're going to see if we can use this information that we know about African violets to promote more flowering. First off, I want to back up and do a little basic biology. What is the purpose of flowers at all? Why do the plants bother to make them? Well, they don't do them just to make us happy and give us something pretty to look at. The purpose of flowers in plants is for the purpose of sexual reproduction. And the whole idea behind sexual reproduction is to provide new combinations of genes so the species can evolve into the future and meet new kinds of challenges in their growing conditions. Couple of things that we need to remember about African violets. These are non-woody perennial plants. They do not have tubers or rhizomes or woody structures to persist from time to time or from year to year, but they are perennials in that they do live for many years. However, they don't have to flower to continue from year to year. They can survive into next year by their vegetative growth only. So they don't have to flower each year like an annual plant would need to do in order to produce seeds to continue the species down through the future. If the conditions aren't good for African violets, they don't have to flower. They can opt out that year and stay in vegetative growth only, with the idea of switching over to sexual growth or flowering only if conditions are good and right for them. So we need to remember that flowering for African violets is not a requirement for them. It is an option. And if we don't make conditions favorable for African violets, in their minds, why bother to flower? I don't have to do this in order to survive down the future. I can choose not to flower. Well, that's not what we usually want African violets to do. So what we need to know is what things will contribute to flowering so we can provide those conditions to the African violets and encourage them to go sexual on us, have a little bit of a love life, and reproduce by flowering. One of the things that we need to understand about flowers is that, first off, it is an option, as we just established. But secondly, we need to think about the energy that it requires for the plants in order to go over from vegetative growth to sexual growth. Flowers are very high energy demands upon the plant. Not only are they high in terms of energy, they're also high to the plant in cost in terms of nutrients. It takes a lot of matter in the form of nutrients, and it takes a lot of energy to arrange that matter together in the proper ways to end up with what we call flowers. So the biggest thing that we want to take a look at here is, do the plants have adequate supplies of energy, and do they have adequate supplies of nutrients in order to stimulate them to move over from vegetative growth and into flowering growth? If they do not have those two basic requirements of energy and nutrients, they're not going to flower for you, and that's what we need to take into consideration with challenging African violets to move over to flowering. So what kinds of plants will flower in terms of these costs, in terms of energy and nutrients? Well, first off, you have to be a mature plant. If you are a baby plant, you can't afford to go into flowering. You can delay your flowering into a future year when you're big enough and you've got energy and nutrients to spare. So don't expect your new cuttings or your baby seedlings to flower. they're not going to do it. Secondly, we need plants that have good energy supplies, and we're going to get into how they get those energy supplies in a few moments. And then secondly, the plants have to have adequate nutrient supplies, and we're going to talk about that in a moment as well. But as long as we have a mature plant, we have sufficient energy, we have sufficient nutrients, the hope is that the plant will flower for us. So what environmental factors are out there that are going to affect energy? Well, the obvious one is going to be light. And I've put a spectrum up here to show you that plants are going to be using predominantly, see if I can get my laser on here, they're going to be using predominantly light in the blue range and over in the red range in order to stimulate them to flower. We not only need the proper quality of light, but we need the proper quantity of light as well. Temperature is going to be another factor that will come into play. Obviously, frozen African violets are not going to bloom, but most of the plants are going to survive within a relatively narrow temperature range. And if we don't have the right temperature that allows the chemical reactions within the cells to take place in a proper order, we're not going to get flowering. So if we grow our plants too cool, they're not going to flower. If we grow our plants too hot, obviously that's not going to be healthy for them, and they're not going to flower as well. Fortunately for us, African violets prefer a window that's very common to what we need and feel comfortable with. So if it is a comfortable growing temperature for you, it's probably going to be a comfortable temperature for the African violets, and chances are they're going to flower. Now, about the environmental factors for nutrients. The obvious one that probably leaped into your mind is fertilizer, the nutrients, and the never pester kids, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are going to be important, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a future slide. You may not have also thought about water. Water is going to be necessary to transport the nutrients from the soil up throughout the plant body. And if your plant is dehydrated and struggling for water, it's not going to be able to flower. It just flat out isn't going to do with that. Another factor tied to this is humidity. Humidity changes the ability of the plant to draw water up into the growing parts. And if we don't have at least enough humidity or water in the air around the plant, the movement of water and the nutrients from the roots up into the plant are going to be inhibited. And so humidity is going to be a factor as well. Another side effect with humidity is that the blooms as they're developing, the flowers as they're developing, are fairly delicate structures. And if you're trying to grow the plants in a very, very dry environment, the blooms may blast or dry up and fall off just because it's not conducive for their growth because the humidity is too low. Other important factors that will affect flowering, diseases and pests. If your plant is under attack by a mold disease, if it's got powdery mildew on it, if it's being attacked by thrips or mites or whatever else, it's not going to be able to flower very well. That just flat out stands to reason. Genetics is going to be another important factor, and I'm going to hit on that in more depth in a future slide. But yes, there are some African violets that are genetically predisposed to flower freely, and there are those that really don't want to flower at all, and we have a hard time getting those plants to put flowers on for us. A little bit about the growth structure of African violets is kind of a review here, and I'm going to turn on my laser pointer for a moment. Most African violets are going to have an apical bud or an apical meristem, and that is going to be producing the leaves, but more importantly, it also produces these little side buds over here, the axillary or lateral buds that are down at that angle between the stem and the leaf. Now, in most of our African violets where we have the rosette style of growth, those nodes are kind of compacted together and you don't have those big stem areas between one layer of leaves and the next layer. But in our trailers, we do get that stretched out effect on the stems. So if you've ever looked at a trailer, you can probably see those axillary or lateral buds a little bit more easily. Now, African violets don't usually flower from the apical or terminal bud. There are some other gesneriads like the syringas, the smithanthias that do flower from that terminal bud. African violets are going to flower from the axillary buds, and so it's the axillary buds that are going to produce the growth. And here's the question we need to ask. If that growth from the axillary bud is vegetative, then we're going to get suckers. Usually that is not what we want to have happen with our African violets, except with maybe the trailers where we do want them to sucker and branch a little more freely. What we're wanting those axillary buds to do is to flip over into the sexual format and become flowers. And that is what we're trying to get in here. But all of those things are coming from those axillary buds. I've got a diagram up here at the top, which is a microscopic cutaway, which is showing the terminal bud, our apical meristem up here at the top. And then here at the side, we have the axillary buds. I've left the labels in here. And this is where the flowers are going to be produced. Now, why do they change from vegetative to sexual? I've been searching the scientific literature on this, and I haven't been able to find a real clear representation. I think it may have to do with what is the growing conditions. If the African violet is feeling threatened, it may decide to keep those axillary buds as suckers and continue the vegetative growth. It's only if it's feeling, say, comfortable, it's feeling mature, it's feeling sexy, if I can use that term loosely, it's going to switch over and make the flowers that we really want. But I haven't been able to really find a good explanation as to why those axillary buds would switch from vegetative to sexual. And if we could figure that out, we probably would be able to stop the development of suckers and get more flowers out of our plants. We do know that in other plant species, the length of day can control the switch from vegetative growth to sexual growth. And I'll give you a hint. We actually call these long day plants. And I've got an iris up here as an example of something that's a long day plant. It really isn't the day length that's important. It's the length of the night. Do the irises have short nights? And so in the springtime, as we're recording this session and getting ready for the convention, my irises are starting to bloom in my yard. Well, what's happening is that the days have gotten long, but more importantly, the nights have gotten shorter. And once the nights have gotten shorter than a critical point, then those plants are going to flower. Other kinds of plants are known as short day plants that are going to flower on short days. Again, it's actually not the day length that they're responding to, it's the night length. Have the nights exceeded a critical length of time, and then they'll flower. Mums are going to be one of the examples that you're familiar with, but at Christmas time, poinsettias are going to be a short day plant responding to that lengthening of the night that we have around Christmas time in our northern hemisphere, and that's going to stimulate them to flower. Temperature can also be a signal to switch from vegetative to sexual, so that's something to kind of keep in mind. However, African violets don't follow the rules that the irises and the mums do. African violets are known to be a day neutral plant. That is, as long as they've got enough daylight and have enough energy, they're going to flower. They do not respond to changing day length. Now, some of you may dispute me at this point and say, now, hey, wait a minute. My windowsill grown African violets don't flower much during the wintertime, and they've switched over and they are flowering more as the days are getting longer in the spring. That probably is happening for you, but it's not because of the response to the day-night signal. It's response to how much light the plants have to work with. As the days are getting longer in the spring, those windowsill plants are going to have more energy to work with, and correspondingly, they're going to flower. African violets don't usually respond to temperature. They're what we would call temperature neutral. However, having said that, I would be amiss if I didn't mention there's a couple of the species plants that do appear to flower underneath certain temperature conditions. We haven't been able to sort out whether it's the day length that they're responding to or the actual temperature, but Grotziana, the big challenge to flower, and I have yet to get this thing to flower for me, is known to respond to colder temperatures. Magingensis occidentalis and Titensis are two other species that seem to have a temperature requirement in there. But for most of our commercial hybrid African violets, it's going to be regular growing temperatures. It's what's going to allow them to flower. For blooming success, the plants are going to require energy, which means they're going to need enough light. They have to be of a certain age. They need to be a mature plant that has energy left over, that it's not putting into making new leaves and growth. It needs to be able to be big enough to flower. And one of the things that we can do in manipulating the energy is to keep the plant in a vegetative state by removing the flower buds. And if you are thinking about how you grow for show, the common scenario that everybody uses is to disbud the plant, keep the flowers off, focus the energy into vegetative growth, then stop the disbudding so the plants can then flip over to sexual and stimulate those new axillary buds to make flowers and go ahead and give you a nice head of bloom. But it's all energy related. Some other energy considerations that you may not have thought about. There's only so much energy to go around when the plants decide to flower. And so the kind of flowers that you have on your plant genetically are going to make some differences on how much you can spend and what kind of investment in the energy you can get. So think about having a budget. You've got 100 energy units to spend. So how do you divide those up? Well, one way of doing that is divide those up into quite a number of small flowers, because small flowers don't require a lot of energy to make. If, however, you are making large flowers, you're not going to be able to make as many flowers for the same energy budget. You'll be able to make a fewer number of large flowers as opposed to many smaller flowers. Petal count comes into play here. Each row of petals that you put in costs the plant more energy. So if you have single blooms, you're likely to get more flowers. If you start putting in double blooms or even triple blooms, you're not going to have as much energy to make as many flowers. So consequently, those highly double, triple petaled flowers are usually fewer in number on the plants just because of the energy it costs them. Surface area. I've got a picture up here of a plant that has nice little frills at the end. That's going to cost the plant energy. It's having to put matter and energy into making that extra surface area on that petal, and that plant is not going to be able to make as many flowers as opposed to a plant that has just straight blooms that doesn't have all that extra bloom on it, or that extra area on it. We do have some plants that will put up additional flower stalks at each leaf. That's not the common. Most send up one flower stalk, but when you can send up two, that's going to give you a bigger head of bloom, but it's going to cost you more energy. So it's not a very common trait that we see in many of our African violet cultivars because of the high energy cost that it has on the plant. Now, for blooming success, we want to talk about nutrients. We need to have fertilizer in order for the plants to grow. The ratio of nitrogen-potassium seems to play into the kind of growth that you get from the African violet. If you have mostly a high nitrogen fertilizer, you're going to have more vegetative growth. If you get more phosphorus, the middle number, the shock of having the extra phosphorus in there probably activates a number of energy compounds in the plant, such as ATP, ADP, and so forth, and you'll end up with perhaps more flowering. So fertilizer can help with shifting the plant from vegetative growth to flowering growth. So something like this bloom boost with a 1030 number in here can help shift the plant over. But I would like to think of this as being a shock to move the plant from vegetative growth to flowering growth. It's not going to be the kind of thing that you would use every day, because it's going to essentially overburden the plant and could kill it. Blooming success cues for water. You need adequate water. So if you are wick watering, where the plant has a constant supply of water, many growers prefer that as opposed to top watering, where the plant might get dry in between and interrupt that water flow. You also need to have adequate humidity, again, to help pull the water and the nutrients up into plant, but to also protect those delicate flowers from being damaged by the dry air. Blooming success can also be affected by the root growth in the pots. If the roots have a lot of space, that is, they've got a lot of places to go, the plant is encouraged to continue to do vegetative reproduction. Many of you in your blooming or growing plants for show will know about potting cuttings up from smaller to larger to larger to larger until you reach the size pot that you want to have the plant bloom in. That keeps those roots stimulated, keeps them reaching out. If you have a constrained space, that is, your roots have reached the pot and are starting to wrap around the edges of the pot, that signals to the plant that, whoa, I can't do any more vegetative growth. Let's switch over and do sex for a while. That'll be a signal to switch over to flowering. So I've got a diagram here showing a plant. The roots are just starting to reach the edge. We've got wick watering to bring the water up. Not surprisingly, since the roots are starting to reach the edge, the plant is switching over to flowering here. So you can control by your potting and potting size when you want the plant to switch over from vegetative growth to sexual reproduction. And this is exactly what we do with many of our growing for show tips. Genetics. And yeah, this isn't exactly one of the things that we would like to see in our flowers. This is St. Paulia botanica. Some of you will remember this one from a couple of years back, which has a genetic mutation where it tries to turn the petals into anthers, and we get actual pollen sacs out here on the end of what would be the petals. This isn't exactly what we want to have happening, but genetics does play into the number of the flowers. You can, as a hybridizer, select for higher bloom count, and it can, to some extent, affect the size of the flowers. The Russians have been very good about selecting for bigger and bigger and bigger blooms, but notice that you get fewer blooms on those plants at a given time because, again, that energy drain going into making those bigger flowers and the nutrient drain going into making those flowers. So the genetics does affect the use of the energy and the use of the nutrients that you put into flowers, but usually you've got a finite energy budget. And back in that previous slide, I showed how you might divvy that budget up into numbers of flowers, sizes of flowers, and so forth. But there is a genetic component here, and some plants are more predisposed to have a higher energy budget, put more energy into flowering. One of the examples that I like to use about genetics and blooming are the trailers. The trailers are often really known for having massive amounts of flowers, but you'll notice you're getting lots of little flowers. Again, dividing up the energy into a lot of flowers because you have it to work with. We can select hybrids for flowering ability. Hybridizers do this all the time. They don't usually release a hybrid that has a low inability to flower or a low number of flowers. That's not what they tend to select for. There are some plants that are notoriously shy about blooming and hard to get to flower, and there are some that are easy to flower and flower very freely. You could figure what you grow for show. This is the way selection has gone on doing plants. So you can select for a high or low flower count. And there is some ability to select for whether you get one flower stalk at each leaf or perhaps multiple flower stalks. The highest that I have seen is 7 to 9 flower stalks coming up off of one bloom area, one leaf axil. Saw this in an historical record back in an older African Violet magazine. I believe the plant was known as Alibaba. Lots of tiny little flowers, lots of things on there, but it never really developed into much because of other kinds of genetic problems. But it is something that hybridizers can look at and select for as whether you get multiple bloom stalks. Now, one of the things here for blooming success miscellaneous. If all else fails, shock the plant. Convince it that it needs to move out of vegetative growth and move it over into sexual growth. Now, how do you do this? Squeeze the root ball. If you've got a plastic pot that it's manipulative and you can actually put a little pressure on it, actually squeeze the thing. Constricting the roots will help convince it that it's being threatened and it needs to go flower. It's made those roots constrained. We talked about the effect of pot size. That's going to be imitated by squeezing the root ball. You can actually take your pot and bounce it on the tabletop, and that earthquake, if you like, that shock will often stimulate the plant to flower. It'll be about a month to 6 weeks before that shows up, but basically give the plant a little earthquake. Dale Martins is one of the ones that talks about disturbing the roots of seedling gesneriads to convince them to grow. Well, in this case, you give your plant a little shock, bounce it on the tabletop. It can convince it that it's threatened and it needs to switch over from vegetative to sexual reproduction. I've mentioned this already, but a fertilizer shock. Doing a switch over to a high phosphorus number, again, only a temporary kind of thing for maybe a couple of weeks, but this can be a shock to move the plant from vegetative growth into sexual growth. Changing the light, boosting the light by maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours, and again, maybe not for a long period of time, but for a couple of days, can give that extra energy boost to move the plant from a vegetative growth over to a sexual growth on flowering. So rather than keeping the plant on the same day-night cycle forever and ever and ever and ever, give it a boost of light for about a week or so and see if that doesn't help. Excuse me. And this one, talk to your plant, tell it if it doesn't flower, you're going to throw it on the compost pile. I have seen many, many accounts about this seemingly, non-scientific method actually works. If you threaten a plant, tell it you don't bloom, you're going to go to the great compost pile out in the backyard. For whatever reason, it seems to make a difference on plants flowering. Don't know why that works, but it shows up a lot of times here. So some final thoughts on this program. First off, our modern African violet hybrids have been genetically selected for flowering. There are some that have crept into the business that have something unique about them, either in foliage or a bloom color or something else, that we keep them around even though they don't flower very prolifically. But most of our modern cultivars have been deliberately selected for flowering. So if you've got a modern hybrid, not a species, if you've got a modern hybrid and you've got it under proper growing conditions out here where it's getting the proper lighting for energy, it's getting the proper fertilizer for nutrients, it's getting the proper water, it ought to flower for you when it reaches a specific size. Now, I will admit some of the species can be a little tricky, like Grotziana, to get it to flower. That's a topic for another program on another day. If you have a plant that fails to flower, I see this all the time on Facebook where somebody is posting to one of the groups. I've had this plant I inherited from my mother or my grandmother. It's been sitting in the same pot and it hasn't flowered in 3 years. Why hasn't it flowered? It's getting too little energy or too little nutrients. How do you fix that problem? Repotting. Trim it back. Put it in some fresh soil, start it in a new fertilizer regime, remove those oldest leaves, which are probably yellowed by this time anyways. You want the flowers to appear on the new growth, so you need to get it growing again vegetatively, and then you're setting the plant up when it gets a little bigger, a little more mature. It can switch over from vegetative growth to sexual. So fertilizing, increasing the light, those two situations should help improve your chance of getting the stubborn African violets to flower. So this concludes my presentation for our 2021 Cyber Diamond Celebration, 75 years for the African Violet Society of America. I thank you all for your attention and for attending this presentation. May all of your African violets flower well for you. And if you have some questions about anything that I've said in the program, want some hints about blooming a particular species, you can always contact me at my email address, jsmith4@bsu.edu. That address always shows up in my column in the African Violet magazine. So again, everybody, thank you so much. It has been great to be here to talk to you today, and I hope you're having a marvelous convention. Bye-bye.